may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, guys, I have a very exciting announcement where y'all know that I kind of came out here and I said, hey, what kind of goals do you want to see on Patreon? I mean, we've been getting so much support over there lately where I want to make sure that we can do exciting things when we reach certain milestones, because I don't want to be just sitting here and celebrating by myself. I want to celebrate with everyone. So I think our next milestone of what we are going to do over on Patreon is once we hit a certain amount of supporters there, we are going to be launching a very high stakes Dynasty Fantasy Football League, and it's probably going to be like a $500 buy-in. It is definitely going to be exclusive to everybody on Patreon. But what's exciting is I'm going to be going through and just randomly choosing a supporter over there on Patreon once we hit that milestone. And I'm going to be doing a free giveaway for a spot in the league, a free spot in the $500 buy-in Dynasty League, where, I mean, the overall pot's going to be $6,000. So I don't have the payouts exactly squared down yet, but pretty much first place, you can guarantee it's going to be at least $3,000. So yeah, that's very exciting. I think that's a lot more exciting than just a jersey giveaway or something. Let me know what y'all think of that idea. And yeah, that should be it. And please, if you want in that high stakes league over there on Patreon, I put up a post just going, hey, who would like in? Go leave your name down there on that post. That way I can make sure I'm reaching out to you whenever we are looking to fill the league. But that's it. Let's talk about some of these rookies that are being drafted very late in drafts. Let's talk about some guys that are going at the very end of the third round in Superflex formats. At the very end of the video, I'll go through and talk about some of the own rookie drafts that I have actually done in those Flock Patreon Dynasty Leagues and talk about where I'm drafting some of these players in those spots. But nonetheless, let's dive into it and let's talk about Chuba Hubbard. And here, I know with Chuba Hubbard, guys, he goes to Carolina. Yes, Carolina has a running back that's okay, I'd say. I mean, most people have heard of him. He's a little bit under the radar, so I know that our audience is a little more dedicated than the average audience, so they probably know the name, but maybe you don't. Christian McCaffrey is a pretty good running back down there in Carolina, but Chuba Hubbard coming in, I think we can say that CMC is probably going to be good enough to win that starting job over Chuba Hubbard. But at the very least, I mean, Hubbard's going to be the running back 2 in that backfield. I mean, they have no clear competition that you could expect Chuba Hubbard to have to fight for that running back 2 spot. And we already saw what that looks like if CMC goes down. We already saw Mike Davis come in, and Mike Davis was a running back 1. Mike Davis immediately stepping into that situation, who I think we can take a step back and we can look at his overall prospect profile coming into the NFL a few years ago, and we can go, you know what? Chuba has more upside. Chuba Hubbard, yes, maybe he's not as good as a pass catcher as Mike Davis, but at the end of the day, I mean, he is still someone that we have seen elite production from in college before. Like we have said so many times, Chuba Hubbard was actually a favorite to win the Heisman in 2020. And yes, my personal theory is if you look at what he did in that 2019 season, his sophomore year, and going into his junior year, just the fall off across the board. I mean, he went from being a track star, just putting up a ridiculous amount of production at Oklahoma State, to someone coming in doing nothing at Oklahoma State and at the same time posting a pretty bad 40-yard dash time. So what that tells us is it goes, hey, someone doesn't just naturally go from being a track star to being a below average running back with their speed coming into the NFL. No, that doesn't happen at all. We are expecting Chuba Hubbard to be faster than Travis Etienne. If you looked at what a lot of smart people were talking about these running backs in offseason ago. So I think that we can come away with a conclusion, and we're not just going to be an insane conspiracy theorist here, that with everything going on, and I hate to use that excuse, trust me, I hate when people use COVID excuses about anything really in real life, but with everything going on in 2020, I think maybe it's just the case that Chuba Hubbard didn't have his mind in football. We know that he had that fight with his head coach. Don't need to talk about that. But nonetheless, I think this is one scenario where you can go, hey, maybe this is a player that has an elite talent profile when he's on his ass. When he's actually working, he can come out and he can possess the upside to be a running back 1 in fantasy if he's put into the right situation. Now he's put into an entirely different situation, going from Oklahoma State, going to the NFL, where they're going to be on his ass. They're going to be going, hey man, I mean, if you're not showing up, you're not putting in your effort, you're not making the roster. And honestly, that is something that I really like with Chuba Hubbard, because when you're investing into these late rookies, You don't want a guy that's just going to be a roster clogger where you're really never going to be able to start him. Just say a wide receiver 3 and you're going, okay, I mean, yeah, I like his talent, but I would much prefer having a running back that we know, hey, if Christian McCaffrey is playing, Chuba Hubbard, you're not even considering starting him. I mean, that's never a thought that's going to cross your mind. But if CMC goes down, if he's injured, if anything happens, Hubbard could come in and he could be a low-end running back 1, maybe a high-end running back 2. It doesn't matter. At that point, if you draft him in the late 3rd of your rookie draft, I mean, that's a better pick than you're going to find pretty much anywhere else. Okay, so now our next guy we are going to be bringing up is someone that I will admit he is way too low in our Dynasty rookie rankings over there on Patreon. Y'all know I said that we were going to be consistently updating those throughout the offseason, and the next update, I promise you, he is going to be rising. But let's talk about Dez Fitzpatrick here, who is a wide receiver that lands in a very intriguing spot in Tennessee, where we know that Tennessee is losing a ton of targets that they had last year. I mean, Jonnu Smith is gone, as well as Corey Davis, more importantly. I mean, Corey Davis was an above-average wide receiver last year, and I think that's kind of not giving him enough credit. I mean, he was a very good wide receiver option for the Tennessee Titans. Now they really don't bring in anybody outside of both Dez Fitzpatrick and Josh Reynolds. And Josh Reynolds, I mean, he had opportunities to start in LA. I know a lot of people are going to go, hey, Robert Woods was there, as well as Cooper Kupp and Brandon Cooks for a decent amount of time, as well as Sammy Watkins, all while Josh Reynolds was there. But I mean, if you remember, guys, I mean, he has had the opportunity to be up to the wide receiver 2 on that team. That wide receiver room has seen a significant amount of injuries through Josh Reynolds' career in LA. So I am not looking at Reynolds as someone that can be too exciting. Now, Dez Fitzpatrick, I am going to be hesitant to say he comes in and is an immediate producer. I think that this is someone you're probably drafting for 2022. I think that this is someone you're drafting, you're putting him on your taxi squad, kind of just stashing him away going, let's see what develops here. Because this has been one of the most efficient offenses in the entire NFL over the past few years. And we can sit here and go, hey, if there are targets to be available and the efficiency is going to be there, maybe this is the right recipe for what looks to be, I don't want to say an average NFL wide receiver, but maybe slightly above average. He's going to be just a guy, to be completely honest with y'all. I mean, if you're looking at his prospect profile, the production isn't exactly crazy, but he was playing with Tutu Atwell, and I know that Tutu Atwell doesn't excite most dynasty owners because he weighs less than I do, which is absolutely crazy to think about. But nonetheless, he was still a very good college wide receiver. I mean, there's a reason the Rams decided to take him in the 2nd round. So you could look at Dez Fitzpatrick and you can go, okay, maybe he has an excuse for why he wasn't just a complete dominator in Louisville. And he broke out his sophomore season. That is something you like to see. You also like to see that he ran a 4.49 40. So that makes him a wide receiver that isn't going to be just completely profiled to be in the slot, or a guy that's going to be completely profiled to be a field stretching option. So Dez Fitzpatrick, there are some positive signs to his profile, but more importantly, you're drafting him for the situation, if we're going to be completely honest, because if this is a wide receiver that, say, in the 4th round got drafted by the LA Rams, no, you wouldn't really be too excited about him in the 4th round of your dynasty rookie draft. But given the fact that he goes to a depth chart that he can easily climb, I mean, he can eventually be the wide receiver 2 alongside AJ Brown. I think he is someone worth looking at. Now, y'all know at the beginning of the video, I was saying that we do not want to be targeting wide receivers that look like they're just going to be roster cloggers, guys that we think have talent, but they really have no path to opportunity. Well, here's one of those guys. Here is Jalen Darden. And here with Darden, I was not expecting to be that high on him, to be completely honest, because he looked like one of those metric darlings, these guys that are coming into the NFL, that pretty much everybody that does analytics for Dynasty falls in love with, because he had an absurd production profile at North Texas. And usually with those small school wide receivers, I mean, just think back at Jeff Janis. The Dynasty community will fall in love, and the NFL, they never really value these guys just because they're small school players. They have a hard time transitioning their skill set to the NFL. But Jalen Darden actually gets intriguing draft capital at the NFL level. And why I'm saying that is, I mean, he does easily profile to be a slot wide receiver. I mean, he's 5'8", 174 pounds. And we know that the NFL simply doesn't value slot wide receivers how their dynasty value should be. And this is like the opposite of what we talk about with field stretching options. Someone like Henry Ruggs, where for an NFL offense with how he can bring that elite speed, with how he can stretch the field and create space for those players underneath to soak up the volume, and they can be a little bit more efficient with the presence of Henry Ruggs, that's going to bring more value to an NFL franchise than it is going to bring to your dynasty team, because the volume isn't really going to be there for those field stretching options. But a player like Jalen Darden, who is that slot wide receiver, he's the opposite. I mean, it's going to be very hard for a slot wide receiver to make that big of an impact for an NFL franchise, but they can rack up targets. They can rack up counting stats that is going to be very exciting for actual fantasy football, because we know we're not building a real life NFL team here. We are building a fantasy football team. So that 4th round draft capital that Jalen Darden gets, it's very similar to Amon-Ra St. Brown, where we're looking at St. Brown and we're going, yeah, I mean, it's not encouraging that he lasts till day 3, but he is clearly a slot wide receiver. So, of course, the NFL isn't going to value him out dynasty owners should. And I think you can say the same thing here with Jalen Darden. He lands at a horrible spot with the Bucs. But if you look at his production at North Texas, I mean, it was straight up ridiculous. So if you're looking at counting stats, no, you're not going to see much with Darden. But if you're looking at it through the context of the North Texas offense, this is where it gets extremely exciting. Because this was an offense that was only able to have 283 passing yards a game. And if you look at what Jalen Darden accounted for, he accounted for 132 of those receiving yards a game. So that's almost 50% of the receiving yardage accounted for by Jalen Darden. And what's even crazier about this is this offense averaged 2.8 passing touchdowns a game. So you hear that and you go, okay, I mean, if any wide receiver is able to average just say a touchdown and a half a game, that is absurd. I mean, how did they account for over half of the touchdowns in their passing offense in college? But no, Jalen Darden surpassed that number and he crushed it. So while the overall offense averaged 2.8 passing touchdowns a game, Jalen Darden averaged 2.1 receiving touchdowns a game. So he was accounting for about 70% of the passing touchdowns at North Texas, which is, I mean, it's absurd to talk about. He also has a decent athletic profile for a slot wide receiver. So, I mean, there are a few things to be excited about there. Obviously, the situation playing behind Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Scotty Miller, Tyler Johnson. There are a lot of wide receivers there. But, I mean, if you're going to be able to get him at the end of the 4th, sometimes at the beginning of the 5th of your dynasty startup, I mean, that is extremely exciting. Okay, so let's get to our last player up here. Someone that I've been drafting in way too many leagues, to be honest. I think that I am probably a little too high on him currently. But let's talk about Nico Collins. Okay, so obviously this is very similar to the Dez Fitzpatrick scenario, where Nico Collins is a wide receiver going to a great situation where he could easily become the wide receiver 2 on his NFL offense quickly. And with the case of Collins, I mean, he could become the wide receiver 1 on his offense very quickly. I mean, coming out of Michigan, 22 years old, he didn't play in 2020, which of course you don't like to see that. We would have preferred to see what he would have done his senior season. But nonetheless, he has a decent athletic profile, a 4.45 40. He broke out his sophomore year, which is something you want to see. But what I really like to see in the case of Nico Collins is his production in 2019 compared to some of the other wide receivers in this offense. Now, y'all know Donovan Peoples-Jones was a wide receiver drafted on day 3 by the Cleveland Browns. Donovan Peoples-Jones, we've all heard the story by now. I mean, he was the top wide receiver prospect coming out of high school, going into a situation where he has some of the worst quarterback play in college football, really can't produce. But in that same 2019 season, where Donovan Peoples-Jones only accounted for 438 yards, Nico Collins had 729. And I mean, touchdowns almost neck and neck, but DPJ is such a massive wide receiver that should be expected. Now, what is crazy is you see that, I mean, Nico Collins was almost able to double the amount of receiving yards as Donovan Peoples-Jones, and they were neck and neck with receptions. I mean, 37 receptions for Collins. DPG had 34. So this is a wide receiver that was way more efficient with what he got in that same exact offense at the same exact age. And now he's going into a situation in Houston where we can safely say, hey, if Deshaun Watson misses this year, yeah, I mean, there's going to be no value to be had with one of the worst offensive lines in football, with possibly the worst quarterback in football if Deshaun Watson does have to miss 2021. But if Watson plays and we're looking at it, we're going, okay, so in this wide receiver room, you have Brandon Cooks, someone that is never going to be able to see a bunch of volume, someone that is a field stretching option. And then outside of that, you have nobody. So why we are drafting Nico Collins is something we talk about all the time. You're chasing upside. Chase upside, upside, upside. And there is upside to be had if you're the wide receiver 2 on a Deshaun Watson offense. Now, we do not know if Deshaun Watson is going to be playing, but I bet you the hit rate, if you're drafting him at the very end of the 3rd, the beginning of the 4th, is going to be a lot higher on Nico Collins, even if we assume that there's only a 25% chance that Deshaun Watson plays in 2021. Now, let's go over and let's talk about some of my actual Patreon Dynasty drafts that we have had so far and where we are drafting a few of these players. Now, let's go through this kind of fast. Okay, so in the Flock 3, we drafted Chuba Hubbard at the 308 and Nico Collins at the 311. And I do want to point out that these Flock leagues also have veteran players that were not drafted last season because we do not do waivers. We do an 8-round draft that is split up halfway through the offseason. So you have a ton of activity happening during that time. At least you're supposed to. I swear to God, we probably had 6 timeouts. 6 people timed out across all the Flock leagues in our rookie draft. There were so many MIA people, which don't get me started on it. But nonetheless, in that Flock 3, we got Chuba Hubbard at the 308, Nico Collins at the 311. In the Flock 5, we got Chuba Hubbard at the 312. In the Flock 6, we had Diami Brown at the 310. That is something to point out. And Nico Collins at the 311. In the Flock 10, we also drafted Nico Collins. So y'all can see that, Chuba Hubbard and Nico Collins are players that we are drafting over and over and over again. I think it's because both of these guys have upside, and upside is what you need to chase in the later rounds in your Dynasty rookie drafts, because you're not trying to draft the wide receiver 2 there, because if you draft the wide receiver 2 there, that doesn't change your success rate. That doesn't really change your odds at winning anything, to be completely honest. So yeah, I love that those players are falling to the late 3rd, early 4th, and we are going to continue to scoop them up. Now, thank you guys. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. Of course, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton, and I will see y'all with the video tomorrow. I want to give a big thank you for everyone supporting the show in Benjamin, Bill, Jason, Matthew, Hutton, Sean, Freddie's Berto, Andy, Frederick, and Chris.